Today I'm going to show you how I edit audio in Audacity for ASMR. Audacity is a free program and I've been using it almost exclusively for audio editing since I started voice acting back in 2007. It is a free program, which is a huge plus because I am cheap and I like free stuff. So anyway, I redid the recording for Peter Rabbit here, which is a Resnia Reads video. And I'm going to go through the steps and show you how I started it. So we're going to start at the beginning here. And let's hear a little bit. Peter Rabbit, room tone. So what I did there is I slate what I'm doing at the beginning of each track, and since this is a recording of Peter Rabbit, I said Peter Rabbit, of course. Now what we have here in this huge section without any audio, this is me recording the room tone, and I'm going to go into more of that later. Basically, it's the audio that I use to use noise removal to get a cleaner sound in the end. You might also notice that in the entire track I have these spikes, which are peaks in the audio, and what these are is when I make a mistake, or if there's a sound that I want to cut out, like a car passing by, or airplane, or something else that I feel like is going to ruin the immersion of the audio, then I snap, and this makes it a lot easier to look at in post when I'm editing, so I can see what do I need to take out. And you'll see here is that I have a series of several snaps, and this is because sometimes the first snap isn't loud enough, simply enough. So I just want it to be loud enough that it's visible in the audio when I'm editing it later on. And actually, I got this trick from Maria of Gentle Whispering, and I think it's actually a technique that people use when they're recording audiobooks. And although I have recorded audiobooks before, I've only just learned about this technique when I started my ASMR channel. But it would have been so much easier if I had used this technique before, because it cuts back on the audio editing so much, so I don't have to listen to it 3 times as much as the length of the audio, because that's how I used to do it. So anyway, I'm gonna get started. Oh, before I get started on actually editing it though, I want to give you a look at what the other Audacity projects for other ASMR audios that I've edited before. So I'm going to switch over to another window. Let's see here. Right. So this window is my ASMR whips, and whenever I have a new story to tell, I just import the audio here, and it shows up here. So this is an upcoming Edgar Allan Poe story that I did, and to be honest, I have a little difficulty reading these stories since the language is so old-fashioned and it uses a lot of words that I'm unfamiliar with. So even if I do read it in advance and I look up the pronunciations, I still get points of like, wait, that's, the word doesn't have the right stress on that syllable. Or, hold on, that's not how you pronounce that. Oh, right. So you'll see here this first track at the top. That is the raw audio. And I counted about 337 snaps throughout this, like, what, how long is this? This is an hour and 6 minutes. So I have 336 snaps in there. However, some of them, as I showed at the beginning of the video, are multiple snaps for one stop, because I just want to make sure that it appears in the audio. And if you look at the audio waves outside of the snaps, you'll see that the audio levels are lower than this section here, which is the completed master audio, which is all cleaned up and amplified and has several effects on it for immersion. And this third track here is the whispered version of it. You'll see it's considerably longer than the soft spoken version. It's 12 minutes and 22 seconds longer. And this last track here at the bottom is my background sound effects track. And when I'm doing these stories, in which there are two versions of the audio, one softly spoken and the other whispered, I set the background noise to match the length of the longer version, which is usually the whispered version. So then, when I'm exporting it, I can just trim this much off the background noise. So then it's just easier for me to match it up with a shorter version of the audio. So this is what I basically do for my ASMR readings. But I do have another role play that I want to show off. Let me just switch windows for that. So this here is an upcoming role play that I'm working on. And the top track here is the parts that I've recorded. That's mostly just my voice. And the second track here is where I've manually added in sound effects of what it would sound like if I were moving around this space. And the third track, I think, is just the third and fourth tracks are some extra sound effects that I recorded separately from my vocal tracks. And this fourth one here, wait, hold on, fifth. Yeah, the fifth one here is the ambient track. So that plays over the entire audio. And for this last track here, I've added in some really quiet background voices that I hope come off as subliminal. So yeah, that's a look of how it looks behind the scenes when I'm editing the audio. And now I'm gonna go back to the recording that I made of Peter Rabbit. Here we go. I'm gonna close out these other windows just so they don't take up space. Right, so I'm gonna get started on this now and see where the beginning is. I got 2 snaps here, so maybe I actually wanted to start
Once upon a time.
Nope. All right.
The Tale of Peter Rabbit.
All right, there's the beginning of the track. So I'm just going to Control I here to split the audio so I know where it actually begins. And just based on what I've heard so far, I think I can cut this part out. And on my computer, I've set a hotkey to the letter Z. So I know, so it's much easier for me to delete unneeded audio. Since I'm right-handed and I'm using my mouse for most of the navigation, that means my left hand is free to do the cutting. And it's much quicker for me this way if I have designated keys for each hand, so I don't have to always go back and forth with my right hand. So anyway, we're just gonna cut this out.
Once upon a time, there were 4 little rabbits.
All right, so that's the beginning of the audio. I just want to check what I have here, and it'll give you an idea of the things that I record before the parts that you actually hear. And this is after the room tone that I recorded.
Okay.
Alright, and there it just sounded like I was getting myself situated, clearing my throat and whatever. And you could probably heard a little banging noises against my microphone stand, which is not very conducive to an immersive experience, so don't want to put that in there. Now, here's another spike in the audio. And I just want to make sure which part I'm cutting out before I get to the section that I re-recorded for that.
But round the end of a cucumber frame,
Right, so in that section you kind of hear a little rumble in my throat, and it's not very pretty. So we're gonna cut that out. There we go.
Dreadfully frightened. I think I got some mouse noises there. Peter was most dreadfully frightened. Peter was most dreadfully frightened. He rushed all over the garden, for he had forgotten time, leaving his jacket behind him. Car. Mr. McGregor.
So you may have heard right there that I said car because cars are loud and they ruin takes and they destroy the immersion of ASMR. So if you don't want that, you gotta pause, let the car pass, and then continue. Okay, looks like we had some technical difficulties there. My screen went black. Hopefully I don't lose too much. Anyway, so, where was I? Right, so we're gonna cut this part out because don't need car noises.
Behind him, Mr. McGregor came up with a sieve, full thing to hide in, if it had It would have been a beautiful thing to hide in if it had had, if it had had, if it had not had, if it had not had. Okay. It would have been. It.
Yeah, so that section was just me being messy with words. And we don't really want that when we're telling stories, do we? So, gonna cut that part out. The thing about recording these older books that are in the public domain is they're written in ways that we do not speak nowadays. So my modern tongue trips over some of the way the words are ordered and such. Anyway, I just see this section here, which looks like a bit of a longer silent section than most of the other audio before it. So I'm just going to listen to that and see if it's something that we need to take out. Not really. Sounds like I'm just taking a breath there. And since people do need to breathe, I do keep in the breaths that I record.
Then he tried his Then he tried to find his way straight across the garden. But Then he tried to find his way straight across the garden.
So you might have noticed there that, according to how the wave looks, I just go ahead and determine which part I'm speaking and which part I'm redoing. And then I clear it up as needed.
He went back towards the tool shed. He went back towards the tool shed, but sewing onions. His back was turned towards Peter. His back was turned towards Peter.
So this section here, you may have noticed that I kept the breath sound that comes before the retake. Because often the breath sounds, they sound natural, and I want them to be where they are supposed to be naturally, even when I'm re-recording the take. Because like I said, we're human, we need to breathe. We don't want to sound like we don't breathe. Although sometimes I do take out the breath, but that's only because I'm lazy and don't really want to find a nicer sounding intake of breath. Anyway, it looks like we got most of the peaks in the audio here. And the reason that I wanted to do Peter Rabbit was because it is an easier to read story compared to Edgar Allan Poe. So there's not a lot of peaks that I have to edit out. And this is mostly for demonstrative purposes. So now that we got the peaks out, I'm gonna go ahead and amplify this entire area. So just Control A or select all. I'm gonna go to amplify, and Audacity automatically gives you a number of whatever you're amplifying it to without peaking. So I'm just gonna go ahead and amplify it to the suggested number. I also want to add here that as a listener of ASMR, and now that I'm starting to make my own audio, I think it's incredibly important to pay attention to how loud the audio is. because oftentimes I find that I have to turn up videos to max volume to experience any tingles, and I don't think that's the way it should be, because even if you record at a much lower volume, that doesn't mean that background noise and the noise from your mics isn't going to be picked up just because it's a lower volume. If it's a lower volume, it's just lower volume. So for my videos, I like to turn up the audio as loud as I can without getting it to peak, because I know what it's like to be listening to ASMR and then the video ends and then there's an ad, a video ad, and it's really loud and disrupts my calm state of mind because the volume is at max, and I don't want my listeners to have to go through the same problems. So if you're watching this video to learn how to edit your own ASMR audio, please turn it up as loud as you can. You can get rid of noise removal in post. But then again, it can only do so much, but it's still better than having audio blasted into your ears. Thanks. Okay, now that's all taken care of. This is what the audio looks like now. And now we're going to go back to the beginning of the section that we recorded and select this area, which is the room tone, which we are going to use as a sample for noise reduction. So go ahead and select the area, go to noise reduction, and get noise profile. So now that has a sample of what the background noise sounds like. Then we go to repeat noise reduction, and that takes out the sample audio from the rest of the recording. And when you're recording room tone, you want to make sure that you're not breathing or speaking, and it's as quiet as it can be. Like there can be other noises in the background, like a refrigerator or air conditioning or something like that, because those are constant noises. But if it's something more unpredictable, like a school playground or a noisy street with traffic, then it might be more difficult to get a cleaner noise removal sound. So now that's been applied, we get rid of that. Going back about noise removal, back when I learned about the room tone thing when I was in a film club back in college, and the sound person basically just called out, like, room tone, everybody shut up. And then we had to be quiet for, I don't even know how long they recorded it back then. When I record room tone for my ASMR audio, I just wait until the timer ticks up to 15 seconds after I slate it. And that's usually enough of a sample size for the noise removal tool. Anyway, now that we have applied noise removal, I apply equalization. And when I pull that up, there is a select curve, and I have that on, I have a setting for fancy. You'll see now that using equalization actually amplified it a bit more. So we're going to go back to amplify, and it's going to suggest that we minus, so we lower the audio a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. And then go to Effect again while it's all still selected, and go to Compressor. And I'm going to use the defaults here and compress based on peaks. So we're going to go ahead and do that. And what this does is basically level out the audio so it's not so quiet in some areas, and it'll match the volume of the slightly louder parts. There we go. Now, when I record, I use my mouse to scroll through the pages. And sometimes my microphone picks up the scrolly sounds. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to listen through the entire thing and mute those so it won't be too distracting while you're listening to it. But I'm going to go ahead and put the finished audio of this re-recording of Peter Rabbit at the end of the video. So you can just listen from now to then, or you can just skip ahead.
Once upon a time, they lived with their mother. They lived with their mother. Now, my dears, if it would have been a beautiful thing, it would have been a beautiful thing. It would. Back to his work. Also, he was very damp with Presently, he came to a pond. Peter thought it best. Scratch. Peter scuttered underneath the tree and shut his eyes. His mother, I am sorry to say, his mother put him to bed.
Okay, so I've just done a quick run through the entire audio. Normally at this point, I'm going to listen back to the entire thing to make sure I didn't miss anything. But I'm going to go ahead and put in the completed audio right here. So there we go. If you have any questions or need help, please don't be afraid to leave a comment and I'll try to answer it to the best of my abilities. And thank you for watching.
The Tale of Peter Rabbit by Beatrix Potter. Once upon a time, there were 4 little rabbits, and their names were Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, and Peter. They lived with their mother in a sandbank underneath the root of a very big fir tree. "Now, my dears," said old Mrs. Rabbit one morning, "you may go into the fields or down the lane, but don't go into Mr. McGregor's garden. Your father had an accident there. He was put in a pie by Mrs. McGregor. Now run along and don't get into any mischief. I am going out." Then old Mrs. Rabbit took a basket and her umbrella and went through the wood to the baker's. She bought a loaf of brown bread and 5 currant buns. Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail, who were good little bunnies, went down the lane to gather blackberries. But Peter, who was very naughty, ran straight away to Mr. McGregor's garden and squeezed under the gate. First, he ate some lettuces and some French beans, and then he ate some radishes. And then, feeling rather sick, he went to look for some parsley. But round the end of a cucumber frame, whom should he meet but Mr. McGregor? Mr. McGregor was on his hands and knees, planting out young cabbages. But he jumped up and ran after Peter, waving a rake and calling out, "Stop, thief!" Peter was most dreadfully frightened. He rushed all over the garden, for he had forgotten the way back to the gate. He lost one of his shoes among the cabbages, and the other shoe amongst the potatoes. After losing them, he ran on 4 legs and went faster, so that I think he might have got away altogether if he had not unfortunately run into a gooseberry net and got caught by the large buttons on his jacket. It was a blue jacket with brass buttons, quite new. Peter gave himself up for lost and shed big tears, but his sobs were overheard by some friendly sparrows who flew to him in great excitement and implored him to exert himself. Mr. McGregor came up with a sieve which he intended to pop upon the top of Peter, but Peter wriggled out just in time, leaving his jacket behind him, and rushed into the tool shed and jumped into a can. It would have been a beautiful thing to hide in if it had not had so much water in it. Mr. McGregor was quite sure that Peter was somewhere in the tool shed, perhaps hidden underneath a flower pot. He began to turn them over carefully, looking under each. Presently, Peter sneezed. Kerchoo! Mr. McGregor was after him in no time, and tried to put his foot upon Peter, who jumped out of a window, upsetting 3 plants. The window was too small for Mr. McGregor, and he was tired of running after Peter. He went back to his work. Peter sat down to rest. He was out of breath and trembling with fright, and he had not the least idea which way to go. Also, he was very damp with sitting in that can. After a time, he began to wander about, going lippity-lippity, not very fast, and looking all round. He found a door in a wall, but it was locked, and there was no room for a fat little rabbit to squeeze underneath. An old mouse was running in and out over the stone doorstep, carrying peas and beans to her family in the wood. Peter asked her the way to the gate, but she had such a large pea in her mouth that she could not answer. She only shook her head at him. Peter began to cry. Then he tried to find his way straight across the garden, but he became more and more puzzled. Presently, he came to a pond where Mr. McGregor filled his water can. A white cat was staring at some goldfish. She sat very, very still, but now and then the tip of her tail twitched as if it were alive. Peter thought it best to go away without speaking to her. He had heard about cats from his cousin, little Benjamin Bunny. He went back towards the tool shed, but suddenly, quite close to him, he heard the noise of a hoe. Scratch, 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 scritch. Peter scuttered underneath the bushes. But presently, as nothing happened, he came out and climbed upon a wheelbarrow and peeped over. The first thing he saw was Mr. McGregor hoeing onions. His back was turned towards Peter, and beyond him was the gate. Peter got down very quietly off the wheelbarrow and started running as fast as he could go along a straight walk behind some black currant bushes. Mr. McGregor caught sight of him at the corner, but Peter did not care. He slipped underneath the gate and was safe at last in the wood outside the garden. Mr. McGregor hung up the little jacket and the shoes for a scarecrow to frighten the blackbirds. Peter never stopped running or looked behind him till he got home to the big fir tree. He was so tired that he flopped down upon the nice soft sand on the floor of the rabbit hole and shut his eyes. His mother was busy cooking. She wondered what he had done with his clothes. It was the second little jacket and pair of shoes that Peter had lost in a fortnight. I am sorry to say that Peter was not very well during the evening. His mother put him to bed and made some chamomile tea, and she gave a dose of it to Peter, 1 tablespoon to be taken at bedtime. But Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail had bread and milk and blackberries for supper. The end.